Colonialism is one of the most significant developments in the modern world, and to understand its implications is to understand the politically mediated nature of identity. At the very heart of postcolonial theory is an understanding of humans as social, gregarious animals who will form communities and thereby form various inclusive and exclusive measures by which to maintain those communities. At the very heart of postcolonial theory, just like gender theory and queer theory, is the question of what does it mean to be? What does it mean to be? Which is the question of ontology, the philosophy of being. In particular, postcolonial theory wants to look at the ways that colonialism, as an institutionally propped up method of control and domination, serve to change and affect the identities of those who are subservient to colonial practices. In Ania Loomba's Colonialism, Postcolonialism, she gives a wonderful introduction to postcolonial theory, looking at developments in anti-colonial thought, in the philosophy of identity behind postcolonial theory, recent developments in what it means to be postcolonial, talking about the discussions and the debates which, with anything that is worth talking about, is fraught with contention and confusion over what even colonialism is. In this book, Loomba is primarily going to be looking at thinkers, at least that I'll be focusing on here, such as Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, Hart and Negri, Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Schmidt, etc., etc. Lots of important theorists that are going to be talked about here. And I read this about a year ago, and it just popped into my mind that I haven't done a lecture on it. And I think that in light of what's happening in Gaza right now, it's really important that it's brought to the fore the way that colonialism drastically impacts the lives of people on the ground in very material ways, not just in some abstract ideological sense, because that can often serve, while it sounds intellectual, it can serve to obfuscate things, instead of opening up the very profound reality that things need to change because people are very profoundly affected by colonialism, because as Loomba's going to be talking about, it goes hand in hand with institutions such as slavery. In her introduction, Loomba states that by the 1930s, colonies and ex-colonies of Europe covered 84.6% of the land surface of the globe. Only parts of Arabia, Persia, Afghanistan, Mongolia, Tibet, China, Siam, and Japan had never been under formal European government. That's a very significant amount of the world, and that helps just to statistically put things in perspective of the political and personal sway that colonialism has on the world. It opens up the world such that, as Hart and Negri put it, it is a decentered and deterritorializing apparatus of rule that progressively incorporates the entire global realm within its open, expanding frontiers. Right, so colonialism goes hand in hand with expansionist politics, with the idea that some people deserve to stay in their place and others deserve to invade that space. So there's something very belligerent at the heart of colonialism, which when I'm asked, what's wrong with colonialism, that's one of my main things, is that colonialism is bent on dealing with the classic economic problem, which is too many people and not enough resources, and how to spend those resources best. And, well, colonialism says that, eventually we're going to live in a place too long, it's going to degrade, or we're going to need to expand our population or borders or something like this to achieve greater heights. And colonialism basically gives us a political project by which to justify that. It's a way of ignoring natural limits, ignoring, for example, the ecological problem and thinking about sustained human living, and in essence saying that some belligerent parties deserve to have their agency mediated and met and respected, and others to be a subservient half of this dialectic. And speaking of dialectic, it's very important that I bring to the fore right now Hegel's master-slave dialectic in understanding postcolonial theory, because it's one of the central pieces of philosophical kernels in terms of thinking about problems of identity. Now, I've done a very detailed lecture on Hegel's master-slave dialectic, as well as Hegel's philosophy as a whole in several lectures, but the long and the short of it is that in order to be, there must also be something I am not. For example, for this to be a black book means that black only has meaning and existence by the fact that there is something not black right next to it, namely my hand, for example. And this contrast allows for the differentiation between the random colors that you're seeing right now, such that you see this book as an object of its own and my hand as an object of its own. So differentiation is necessary to being. But in addition, Hegel's master-slave dialectic is for social beings, for things that necessarily create lines of filiation and expression and separation between each other in order to form social communities. So in order for me to have an identity, there must be an other, which I am not. And I must exist in a very precarious relationship to this other. In order for the other to exist, I have to recognize their otherness to an extent, and recognize that in order for me to be me, I can't be them. They need to have their own independent existence. But they also need me to be an other for them, so there's an extent to which the other is constantly trying to debase me, and we're constantly trying to debase each other, but not below a certain level. Because otherwise, we go from being another subject in a social discourse to a mere object. We become debased to the point that we no longer have the confirmation value that we need in a social discourse, and we can no longer yield recognition. One can test this merely by staying in their room for a month without seeing any faces of any kind. You're naturally going to get pretty pumped up and need to see other people because you start to really go into an existential spiral. And in fact, scientifically, we know this is the case. If one does not see their reflection for too long, they will start to have profound discontinuities psychically concerning their own identity because they cannot see themselves reflected in the world. They cannot see themselves as a being because you become so enamored in your being that you cannot see how it is mediated and limited socially. As such, we can see that identity is going to become very problematic when different groups intersect with one another. Because how do you understand another as human when what it means to be human may be entirely different for different cultures? We may have these material vessels in common that are flesh and bone and blood, but there are various other and probably equally important methods by which we determine our identity, such as cultural practices, common memories, common goals. And these may be completely different across cultures, such that, and this has been the case in the history of colonialism, one group comes upon another and is not willing to relegate them to the category of human. They are instead something more base. They are the Vandal, the barbarian, and these are actual names of groups that in English parlance today are just kind of shorthand for anything that's kind of mad and base and unintelligent. But these, in fact, at a time were the names of actual groups, the barbarians. Now, something happened in the history of colonialism which was really important, which was the attempt to wed enlightenment and its focus on scientific objectivity with the subjective, culturally specific notion of valued cultural practices, of what it means to really be a human. So certain European colonialists would go to different nations in Africa or Indonesia or South America or the Caribbean, and in these places they would try to come up with some sort of scientific, and I put scientific in quotes here, method of achieving a biological differentiation between these other races and one's own race. And the notion of race comes into being at the very moment in which scientific rationality comes on the scene to try to form some coherent differentiation between one group and another. Race becomes some sort of inherent biological essence which defines what it means to be a part of this group, and a part of this group which is politically legitimated for one. And of course, race has gone through various seasons of like and dislike in culture. But today, it's well understood that one's worth has nothing to do with their race. Yet, as Ania Loomba put it when referring to Hart and Negri, they wrote, "Fixed and biological notions of peoples thus tend to dissolve into a fluid and amorphous multitude, which is of course shot through with lines of conflict and antagonism, but none that appear as fixed and eternal boundaries." So as cultures start to mend together and we realize that these essentialist lines must break down, for example, when a colonizer comes in with a heap of stereotypes and is forced to realize that those stereotypes are inadequate for understanding the colonized subject, that is a very profound site of struggle that happens at this point. But she mentions how Balibar says that we see today that culture can also function like a nature, like an essence, like race, and can be equally pernicious. For instance, phobia about Arabs today carries with it an image of Islam as a conception of the world which is incompatible with Europeanness. Thus, Muslims are regarded as people who can never successfully assimilate into Western societies, or who are culturally conditioned to be violent, ideas that dominated the media coverage of Islam after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the United States on September 11th of 2001. She goes on further to cite that early modern European views of Muslims and Jews are also important in reminding us that culture and biology have in fact never been neatly separable categories, and that strategies of inclusion and exclusion have always worked hand in hand. And something very central to understanding identity's place in postcolonial theory is those strategies of inclusion and exclusion. The means by which I legitimate other people's behavior and identity. And identity and behavior are intimately related, right? To be me is to, for example, be the kind of person that I would think would be a good person if put into an ethically dubious situation. That I would be able to make the right decision, that I would be able to help other people. This is important to my community, too. For me to be respected in my community is to go along with certain conceptions of right and wrong action, which are legitimated by various normative and socio-political pressures. And these pressures, when exerted on a group that, for example, does not respect your group's presuppositions for what is a good or right or wrong action, we get into some issues. When, for example, we have the predominantly Christian West and the predominantly Muslim kind of Arabian subcontinent or Middle East area, we get to a fundamental discontinuity where there are disagreements about what it means to have some sort of undergirding force for our action, such that now this dichotomy creates the very condition by which oppression can be achieved. She quotes P. Sainath, who says that based on the premise that the market is the solution to all the problems of the human race, it is too a very religious fundamentalism. It has its own gospel, the gospel of saint growth, of saint choice. And this notion of market expansion and domination is something key to the neoliberal paradigm, where what controls the legitimate nature of a political action is whether or not it hinders or helps markets, whether or not it allows for economic choice. And choice here becomes a very dubious term because in many cases, the relationship of people to markets puts them in a position where there is no choice, but in fact there is economic coercion. And the relationship between societies and economies is really important for understanding colonialism, and something that's going to be kind of bred into Loomba's discussion of postcolonial theory. Loomba highlights this important truncation between society and economies by stating in the first chapter, modern colonialism did more than extract tribute, goods, and wealth from the countries that it conquered. It restructured the economies of the latter, drawing them into a complex relationship with their own, so that there was a flow of human and natural resources between colonized and colonizing countries. This flow worked in both directions. Slaves and indentured labor, as well as raw materials, were transported to manufacture goods in the metropolis or in other locations for metropolitan consumption, but the colonies also provided captive markets for European goods. Thus, slaves were moved from Africa to the Americas, and in the West Indian plantations they produced sugar for the consumption in Europe, and raw cotton was moved from India to be manufactured into cloth in England and then sold back to India, whose own cloth production suffered as a result. In whichever direction human beings and materials traveled, the profits always flowed back into the so-called mother country. And we can see the impacts of this on the world today when we talk about, for example, virgin markets. This is a market that has not been adequately punctured yet. It has not been visited by the world economy yet. And as a result, there's lots of resources and labor power and capital there, which can be taken advantage of and made a profit off of. As a result, colonies become captive markets. They become a way to siphon off outside resources in order to fund this expansionist axiom at the very heart of capitalism. And the difference between colonialism and imperialism is an oft-debated one, but it's generally understood that colonialism is a more particular and specific aspect of imperialism as a larger global system. Loomba states, in the modern world, we can distinguish between colonization as the takeover of territory, appropriation of material resources, exploitation of labor, and interference with political and cultural structures of another territory or nation, and imperialism as a global system. So colonies are part of a larger empirical global system, right? Take, for example, Great Britain, who has and has had in the past several colonies, and these are part of the British Empire. So the British Empire as a whole is a sort of structuring apparatus for the way that goods are controlled and dealt out within these colonies, the way that punishment is dealt out and identity mediated. And colonies are individual aspects of this larger imperial system. Loomba very helpfully states that one useful way of distinguishing between imperialism and colonialism might be to separate them not in temporal but in spatial terms, and to think of imperialism or neo-imperialism as the phenomenon that originates in a metropolis, the process which leads to domination and control. Its result, or what happens in the colonies as a consequence of imperial domination, is colonialism or neo-colonialism. Thus, the imperial country is the metropole from which power flows, and the colony or neo-colony is the place which it penetrates and controls. Imperialism can function without formal colonies, as in United States imperialism today, but colonialism cannot. Because very popular in the discourse today is, for example, talking about economic imperialism. This occurs in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany, where labor is outsourced to third world countries who are chosen because they have looser labor laws, they have cheaper labor, and we can gain a profit by basically cutting out some of the more spendy kind of parts of our economic process and thereby siphon off some of the power of these third world countries in order to bolster profits in the first world. And this puts us in a tricky situation when it comes to thinking about what post-colonialism means. Because this is called post-colonial theory. But what does it even mean to be post-colonial? Loomba points out that, in fact, being post-colonial is not necessarily meaning that you're no longer under the control of your former colonial overseer. She writes that if the inequities of colonial rule have not been erased, it is perhaps premature to proclaim the demise of colonialism. A country may be both post-colonial in the sense of being formally independent and neo-colonial in the sense of remaining economically and or culturally dependent at the same time. We cannot dismiss the importance of either formal decolonization or the fact that unequal relations of colonial rule are reinscribed in the contemporary imbalances between first and third world nations. Both of these are with quotation marks, right? Because first and third world carry certain negative connotations. The new global order does not depend upon direct rule. However, it does allow the economic, cultural, and, to varying degrees, political penetration of some countries by others. This makes it debatable whether once colonized countries can be seen as properly post-colonial. And this is a very important debate that I honestly don't really know that we can give a very solid answer, but I think it's important to think about the very lasting historical effects of colonialism that have very material implications for the way that people live their lives. In discussing Foucault, Loomba wants to talk about how Foucault sees people as being controlled from the outside, such that identity is not an autonomous creation, but something dictated by structures of power and language and ideas. All human ideas in all fields of knowledge are structured and determined by the laws of a certain code of language, as Foucault puts it. Thus, no subject is free, and no utterance undetermined by a predetermined order or code. It is in this sense that Foucault pronounces the death of the author, for no single individual is the sole source of any utterance. So just in literary theory, as there's this idea of the death of the author, where writing and language achieves such a self-sufficiency within the text that the author no longer meaningfully changes the meaning of the text, that the author can basically be scrapped because the author is an effect of the text and not some real entity in the sense of the capital A author. In the same way, the authorship of one's own identity is being undercut by Foucault's theory. Ferdinand de Saussure, for example, argued that the relationship between the signifier, which is a sound image, and the signified, which is the concept to which it refers, for example, signifier would be me saying the word book, and signified would be this object I'm holding, is arbitrary, which is to say that words achieve their meaning from an association in the mind, not from any natural or necessary reference to entities in the real world. These associations work through the principle of exclusion, which is to say that any sign achieves meaning diacritically, or through a system of differentiation from other signs. Thus, language is not a nomenclature, or a way of naming things which already exist, but a system of signs whose meaning is relational. And the notion of signs as relational entities is very similar to Hegel's dialectic, which understands recognition as central to identity. That there's something that relates between individual particular members of some group, which gives the group a general status via the relations and the continual propagation of the legitimation of those relations between different people. So, for example, in the case of the word book, to use the same example, there is something that gives this word its unique value, which is not only that it is associated with this book, but also that it is not associated with this wall here, or this camera that I'm shooting with. As such, exclusion is really important to language. It's equally important to highlight not what the word stands for, but what it does not stand for, or what it refers to and does not refer to, or what it effectuates and also should not effectuate. And the should is important there because this necessarily incurs value judgments. The sign or words need a community with shared assumptions to confer them with meaning. Conversely, a social group needs signs in order to know itself as a community. On this basis, we can think of language as ideological rather than objective. Because, right, there's nothing inherent to this word book that it has some sort of objective, a priori relationship to this object which I use the word book to talk about or refer to or delimit, right? Different linguists have tried to talk about, for example, the boo-boo versus kiki experiment, where you have one shape that's more rounded and one that's more jagged, and you ask subjects which one is boo-boo and which one is kiki, and boo-boo will be the more rounded one and kiki the more articulated one, because the word boo-boo is more rounded in the mouth and kiki more direct and abrasive. So there are some basic ways in which we can detect the way that people associate sound with images, thus with reference, and which they signify. But it's also commonly acknowledged by linguists that language is not an objective system. It's mediated by humans, and there's no objective reason why it should be such and such a way. As such, it's really important to understand the determinate conditions under which identity is created, whether that be in a text or outside of a text. And a lot of these thinkers are talking about text, such as Derrida. Derrida read Saussure more radically to suggest that no sign is identical with what it signifies, and there is always a gap between the two. The slippage between words or signs and their meaning is evident in every representation, every utterance. Accordingly, no utterance or text is capable of perfectly conveying its own meaning. But all texts, if analyzed closely enough or deconstructed, reveal their own instability and their contradictions. Meaning, in other words, is not self-present in the sign or in text, but is the result of this gap, slippage, or what Derrida calls différence. A great example of this is when I use the word book. This word is a very general way of talking about this very specific thing. Technically, these behind me are also books. And how do you know that when I say book and I point to this thing, that I'm not actually talking about this book behind me, or this book behind me, or this book behind me? Well, you kind of have to take this gap at face value and say that, well, given the context clues, you seem to be indicating and using the particularities of your facial expression and body language and verbal emphasis to cue me into the fact that this general applies to this particular. But ultimately, there will always remain a gap between the generalities of language and the particularities in which they are used. For example, I can use this word book and be referring to this thing, and each day I can refer to this book as book. And it's technically not the same thing. There are different particularities in the atmosphere and what's going on in my day and the day of the person who's listening to my utterance, such that there is a slightly different association between the general and the particular, and that gap will never disappear. That différence is a key point of contention in postcolonial identity that's going to be brought up. That in fact, ways of knowing provide the lens through which, for example, the Orient or the subaltern or the savage would be seen. So we're always bringing to the fore certain collective theories of assumptions, norms, and values that we use to make up for this différence. And it's much easier to do that in a society that is homogeneous because we all understand roughly the same kind of tools that we have at our disposal. The ways in which our discourse is mediated is understand because people grow up in that discourse, in that society where they understand the rules. But when societies of very different ideologies, very different norms, values, assumptions, goals, etc. come into contact, that différence becomes much more explicit, and this creates the possibility for reconciliation, experimentation, discovery, but also domination, servitude, destruction, violence, etc. Really important for understanding colonialism is the way that it serves as a political tool by which to legitimate violence against certain groups, and particularly that those groups not be seen as human, or at least not human in the same way. Maybe they're seen as reprobates, or libertines, or savages, or, you can use any word that you want to debase another group and justify doing something that you wouldn't do to your own group. And you might argue that, in fact, this is a necessary aspect of human behavior, that we naturally have to do things that we don't really want to, and that maybe we create these group identities in order to facilitate that action for the greater good. But it also seems clear to me that you can argue with relative ease that we also use these identity categories to make us do things that otherwise we would not do, that we couldn't even imagine doing until the differentiation between groups and cultures and values and systems of reference are set up. And one of the important institutional aspects of colonialism is the extent to which it is wed to slavery as an institution. Loomba writes, slavery and colonialism were often facilitated by the fiction that they were attempts to convert infidels. But in actual practice, because of the declared prohibition against Christians enslaving other Christians, slaves were often deliberately not converted. Or alternatively, they were converted but their papers showed their original names so that they could be bought and sold. Medieval and Renaissance literature, as well as travelogues and religious texts, often depicted good Turks, Moroccans, Indians, and others as willingly embracing Christianity. This is an important mechanism of legitimation of the colonial practice, is that you take, for example, this happens today with defectors from various countries, from Venezuela or North Korea or China, and you bring these people into these podcasts and you just use them as an ideological tool for, look, this person is the other, but they're a good other. They're a good black person, a good Chinese person, a good Mexican, whatever you want. You know, these are all very loaded, very problematic ways of speaking, but they load the canon with cannon fodder that can be used for violence. In fact, Loomba continues, religious conversion begins to figure as a justification for economic plunder. For example, in Thomas Middleton's The Triumphs of Honor and Virtue, a pageant presented at the Lord Mayor of London's inaugural ceremonies in 1622, an Indian queen celebrates her own conversion to Christianity, which, she says, settles such happiness on her as that the gums and fragrant spices which the English traders take away from them, indeed all the riches and the sweetness of the East, are only fair exchange for the celestial knowledge that is now hers. As in other writings of the period, the Indian queen's speech intricately mixes the language of religion with that of commerce. It is blessed commerce that becomes a crusader for Christianity. Right? So slavery is a perfect way of discussing the way in which commerce and identity go hand in hand. The ways in which we legitimate taking from other things and other people, things that do not belong to us. Now, slave economies have waned in the contemporary period, but we live in a single world capitalist system, as Loomba says, that structures both the development of some countries and the underdevelopment or dependency of others. Today's world is divided into advanced capitalist countries and underdeveloped ones because the manner in which each of them become capitalist. And in fact, the non-capitalist practice of slavery coexists with, feeds into, and aids the development of capitalism. Thus, pre-capitalist modes do not simply give way to capitalist ones in any simple teleological sense, but persist precisely because they contribute to the growth of the latter. The relation between them is not simple coexistence, but what Hall describes as, quote, an articulation between different modes of production, structured in some relation of dominance. It is in the interest of capitalism that certain older social structures not be totally transformed, and certain older forms of exploitation based on racial and ethnic hierarchies continue to make available cheap labor. If plantation slavery once provided cheaper labor than would otherwise have been available, today the non-capitalist sector continues to play an analogous role. Capitalism coexists with, or is articulated with, these other modes of production. But this coexistence is structured by the dominance of capitalism, which therefore benefits from it. And there's a very master-slave thing going on here. Hegel's master-slave dialectic has several problems with it that leads one to be rife and ready for domination. But we can see with capitalism that its expansion and burgeoning into virgin markets is often seen as some sort of civilizing mission, something sent to get rid of old practices and bring in economic flourishing. But all of these are merely mechanisms by which to come into a country and take advantage of, for example, slave markets and non-capitalist forms of economics. We saw this during the transatlantic slave trade, for example, when European colonialists would go into these African nations. They would come to the western coasts, especially, and they would meet various Africans there who did not see the entirety of Africa as one common diaspora community, where the Senegalese and the Zimbabwean and the Mauritanian and the Egyptian were all some common people. No. Just like people in, for example, the Americas, I don't see the Chilean or the Argentinian as the same nationality or the same group. We're in different societies, in different cultures. We succumb to different norms and we operate under different presuppositions. So in Africa, in the same way, these different tribes did not see themselves as enslaving their common people, their next door neighbor brothers. No. Just like France can invade Germany, or Germany can invade Austria, or Poland can invade Lithuania. I don't know, these neighboring countries, they're so close, but they don't see each other as the same people. In the same way, Africa was like this. And different African tribes would have slavery amongst different tribes because they didn't see each other as part of the same tribe, as brothers and sisters, as white people like to put it, because they thought that all the whites were in some sort of colluded effort against all the black people. These European colonialists would come to the western border and would basically prompt the purchasing of slaves from the central parts of Africa, which by different African tribes would be taken to the edge, and in exchange for weapons and spices and diseases too, these slaves would be bought and sold and taken to North America. And in this case, non-capitalist practices were a staple for the creation of various capitalist practices or the development of capitalism in North America. As a result, it was in the interest of the slave traders to maintain slavery, to not abolish it, because it was such a lucrative practice. In terms of colonialism's exclusionary approach to identity and to its legitimation, Loomba mentions that only the European subject is individuated. The mark of the plural, Alberti Memmi tells us, is a sign of the colonialized depersonalization. The colonized is never characterized in an individual manner. He is entitled only to drown in an anonymous collectivity. They are this. They are all the same. The individual European faces the alien hordes, and if he identifies too much with them, he transgresses the boundary between self and other, and regresses into primitive behavior, into madness. Right? So you can be part of these cultures, but you can't become one of them, because to become one of them, right, here I am using that language, would be to be swallowed into the undifferentiated mad mass of the other. As such, there's a necessary polarization between self and other that must be investigated. We must know the other in some capacity, but we cannot become the other. And the threat of becoming the other becomes a means of subjugation against an amorphous generality, which is in fact just a series of stereotypes, right? Of black people are this, Arabs are this, Africans are this, etc., etc., etc. It's just a series of overgeneralities that are in fact abstractions, often built on the backs of Europeans, not from the behavior of these groups. Now, one of the developments in the late 19th and early 20th century to the study of identity and the psyche was that of psychoanalysis, which tried to wed social practices with some scientific structuralist understanding of the psyche, where in fact there were certain general rules that could be used to understand the development of the psyche and the development of the individual. And in discussing colonial and post-colonial identities, Loomba points out how notions of the universal can also be deeply ethnocentric, because they're formulated in the image of the dominant culture. A highly specific image of culture, or in this case the psyche, is projected as globally applicable. Such a projection works to dehistoricize or depoliticize the notion of the psychic because, as happens in Sachs's case, it does not adequately confront the relation between social structures and the inner lives of human beings. Thus, both in the ways it has projected racial and cultural differences and in the ways it has erased them, psychoanalysis has served colonial interests in Africa and elsewhere. Because, as Freud put it, every new arrival on this planet is faced by the task of mastering the Oedipal complex. Anyone who fails to do so falls a victim to neurosis. But to universalize the Oedipal drama is to suggest that it accounts definitively for the development of identities everywhere. As if there were no differences in the ways subjectivities were formed or sexual dramas played out across the world, or as if no other differences of class or cultural shaped their performance. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari condemned the analytic imperialism of the Oedipus complex, which inflates an unhistorical notion of the family as the site for human conflicts, whereas in reality, the family itself is not immune from political and historical reshaping. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, the structure of the psyche is historical and has a history. So in fact, while we would like to think, or as Freud would like to think, because not a lot of people buy into the Oedipus complex anymore, that there are these universal structures which govern the psyche a priori in the way that desire is mediated and externalized. If we actually go behind this curtain a little bit, we see that in fact this is a historical development in Europe, which had a lot to do with, for example, the internalized misogyny of Europeans at this time, because there's a lot of misogyny in psychoanalysis. Indeed, we see such a sort of problem of psychoanalysis in the ways that it really restricts identity when Frantz Fanon puts at the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks, "At the risk of arousing the resentment of my colored brothers, I will say that the black man is not a man." The colonial experience, Loomba says, annihilates the colonized person's sense of self, seals him into a crushing objecthood, which is why he is not a man. Right, because this notion of, for example, when the U.S. Declaration of Independence says that all men are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Who are men here? Some would argue that they were just males, because in all practical senses, males were the ones that could exercise their rights, that could vote, that could own property, that could have a bank account, etc. Some people would say that no, it's all humans. But we obviously see that this is not the case. We do not legitimate all humans as much as we would like to. Society just doesn't work like that. We often tend to create, whether we know it or not, various exclusionary ways for dealing with other people. And as such, this notion of man is deeply historical and culturally mediated in such a way that this notion of manhood, Black people have historically been seen as savages, as barbarians, as mad, as other, as evil, right? I think of a quote from Muhammad Ali when he's talking about, he was asking his mom when he was little, why is it called devil's food cake and it's black? Or why is it called black magic? Why does black have all these negative associations? But then like angels are white, or the color of cleanliness is white, right? There are all these little associations that weasel Black people out of their share of identity in societies that are historically white. As such, it is colonialism that is now seen as psychopathological, a disease that distorts human relations and renders everyone within it sick. And I think here of William Burroughs talking about language as a virus, and talking about the fact that within every person is a parasitic being acting not at all to one's advantage. And in fact, this may be culture in a sense, and colonialism for sure is a sort of viral parasitic being which thrives off of our hate, our in-group bias, our exclusionary ways of thinking about ourselves, and the ways in which we favor ourselves over others. And this is a sort of psychopathology that really can be dealt with. The ways in which societies create exclusionary techniques. In talking about one of my favorite post-colonial theorists, that being Homi Bhabha, Ania Loomba talks about the ways in which hybridity, Bhabha's kind of most important concept, really investigates that idea of différance from Derrida. When Derrida is looking at the gap between the self and the other, between the generality and the particular which it supposedly refers to, or the particularity which is real and the generality which is some sort of abstraction, we see that in fact resistance takes on a very interesting and much more nuanced sort of approach. It's not just about violence, for example. Resistance, Bhabha says, is not necessarily an oppositional act of political intention, nor is it the simple negation or the exclusion of the content of another culture as difference once perceived, but the effect of an ambivalence produced within the rules of recognition of dominating discourses as they articulate the signs of cultural difference. Right? So we are actually all the time invoking the signs of our discourses materially and affectively and uttering them into the world in order to continue to uphold certain practices. So in fact, forms of resistance, be they anti-colonial resistance or feminist resistance or, any of these different ways of resisting against certain hegemonic approaches to politics, society, and culture. In fact, it doesn't necessarily need to be violence, because Ania Loomba quotes, in fact, Terry Collins here, who states that the colonial presence is always ambivalent itself, split between its appearance as original and authoritative and its articulation as repetition and difference. Right? On the one hand, race, for example, is seen as something essential, which is always there, and as such is some sort of a priori category. But on the other hand, it has to be constantly reinforced through repetition and the difference between the desired outcome and the actual outcome. So on the one hand is this pretended abstract generality of race as an a priori category, or savageness or madness. And then on the one hand is the continual repetitious way in which this generality is reified through its particular action. As a result, there is a constant need to uphold these categories of postcoloniality and coloniality and imperialism when looking at culture. And I think when we look at, for example, Great Britain and its colonial history and the way it impacts its culture, we can see the importance of colonialism for building a sense of national community. And this is one of the important challenges to colonialism, is thinking about undercutting nationalism as a principle of identity. When we realize that, as Nietzsche says, the state bites with false teeth, that everything it has stolen from peoples who live, and has created some sort of abstraction. When we realize that the state is that sort of abstraction created over top of us to impel us to act certain ways, then we realize that in fact it is fraught with holes, and that certain nationalisms today, for example, are seen as good and others are not. She quotes Anthony Giddens, who says that in circumstances of accelerated globalization, which would be today, the nation-state has become too small for the big problems of life and too big for the small problems of life. Here, the assumption is that nationalism now represents the local rather than the global. But a world hegemon like the United States is arguably more, not less nationalistic than many less powerful polities. The difference is that the United States projects its own nationalism, and that of its allies such as Israel, as being inclusive, multiracial, and democratic, and the nationalism of others as opposed to it, from Russia, China, Afghanistan, or Palestine, as sectarian or bigoted. Thus, U.S. national culture is understood to embody the spirit of globalization, whereas other national cultures are archaic, medieval, sectarian, or sectional. right? You think of the sort of way in which imperial methods of the US are framed today, where they're seen as, for example, protecting Israel, which is the sole democracy in the Middle East, or, protecting these innocent people from the whole Palestinian population, which is just Hamas. All of it, just because Israel says so. This is a way by which we protect our national interests and the nationalism of Israel while forsaking that of Palestinians or Afghanistan or other, Middle Eastern countries, wherever they may be, just because the Middle East is of importance to me and geopolitically today. And Loomba talks a lot about the intersection between post-colonial movements and feminist movements, and I think it'd be well worth your time to read, at the very least, this Challenging Colonialism chapter where she talks about this. But just to mention a few, she says that not only does women's active participation in politics not necessarily indicate a feminist consciousness or agenda, but in recent years, there has been an effort to harness women's political activity and even militancy to right-wing movements, and especially to religious fundamentalism. In various parts of the world, women have been active campaigners for the Hindu, Islamic, or Christian right-wing movements. The question of religion is an especially tricky one for post-colonial feminists, as it has suffered and surfaced as a major factor in women's relationship to the nation and to post-colonial politics. Many post-colonial regimes have been repressive of women's rights, using religion as its basis on which to enforce their subordination. National identity in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and several other places has been molded by the Islamicization of civil society, an alliance between the fundamentalism and the state, and severe curtailments of freedom for women. And I think this is super important to talk about, is, for example, we see Marjorie Taylor Greene as a very prominent female politician who is all for the right wing, and she just throws in these crazy right-wing talking points, these real QAnon kind of talking points. And she is a way in which the right-wing movement can give off the facade of being more inclusive, when in fact it's just cherry-picking certain extremely radical women and putting them in places of power. So here, inclusion works as a safeguard against future inclusion. And in addition, when certain kind of multicultural, kind of blue-haired liberals, for lack of a better word, want to talk about respecting these highly Islamic fundamentalist groups such as the Taliban in Afghanistan, and talk about, oh, they deserve national self-determination. Well, yes, they do deserve national self-determination, but also they shouldn't just be satisfied with, for example, women being oppressed, not being able to speak in public or go to parks, right? I think it's really important that we understand the limits of national identity here, and how if we enforce this exclusionary sort of protectionist notion of identity where they over there have their identity and we have ours, I think that actually can be a form of exclusion where you pretend as if you're being inclusive, but in fact really what you're doing is making this other group immune from criticism. This is often done today with charges of Islamophobia on anyone who is opposed to any Islamic ideas in any way, where if someone says that, for example, Islam is not for women's rights, you have these Muslim women who will come in and say, no, Islam is a feminist religion. And you have this feminist discourse being co-opted into a religious fundamentalism and becoming a platform upon which, again, certain cherry-picked women stand as a bolstering mechanism for these very exclusionary practices. And one of the most important questions for post-colonial theory is that of the subaltern, of when someone has been put in a place of subjugation through colonialism, how can they punch up? How can they fight back? As Loomba asks, in what voices did the colonized speak? Their own, or in accents borrowed from their masters? To what extent are we the products of dominant ideologies, and to what extent can we act against them? From where does rebellion arise? And that is the great question of postcolonial theory, in addition to what does it mean to be. It is a question of agency, rebellion, opposition, assertion, and I would just like to ask you as a listener to be thinking about this. Think about how it works in your own life as a probably privileged person if you're watching this on a phone or a computer and you have Wi-Fi, and also how it might operate for those in less privileged positions. People in refugee camps in Syria or Gaza. How can you make a difference? And how can they make a difference? And how can you add to the discourse? That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, postcolonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because anything that you give helps me out so much. It helps me purchase all my books and continue to provide content, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.